Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's market update. Well, let's start with some good news. Energy prices have continued to move lower as negotiations between the US and Iran have shown encouraging signs of progress. Lower oil prices are something we've been hoping to see because they can provide relief for consumers, for businesses, and ultimately for inflation. Gas prices are down about 20% from their peak in mid May, although they do remain about 30% higher than they were before the conflict began in late February. Still, this is a positive development for the markets and the economy. But I also think it's important not to get too comfortable. We're probably not out of the woods just yet when it comes to inflation. For one, the situation in the Middle East remains fragile. Diplomatic progress is encouraging. It doesn't necessarily take much for geopolitical tensions to flare up again. So while we're happy to see energy prices moving in the right direction, we're not ready to assume that this trend is permanent. The second issue is one that's been receiving less attention, but I think it could become increasingly important over the coming quarters, and that's the inflationary impact of the AI build-out. We're in the middle of what's really an unprecedented wave of investment in artificial intelligence infrastructure. Companies are spending hundreds of billions of dollars building data centers, and they're buying hardware that's needed to power AI applications. And that surge in demand is creating shortages throughout parts of the technology supply chain. One area that's receiving a lot of attention is memory chips. Companies like NVIDIA have signed long-term supply agreements with memory manufacturers as they race to secure the components needed for AI systems. And these suppliers are struggling to expand capacity quickly enough to keep up. So those higher input costs are beginning to show up in consumer prices. As an example, Apple recently announced price increases of roughly 15 to 20% across much of their product lineup. They were citing memory chip costs moving higher as one of the key drivers. And I don't think Apple will be the last company to make that kind of announcement. We've actually seen Microsoft and Nintendo and others make the announcement as well. But as more companies face higher technology costs, we'll likely continue seeing those increases passed on to consumers. So while inflation may be easing when it comes to energy, we're seeing new inflationary pressures emerge from a completely different part of the economy. From an investment standpoint, I don't think this really changes our broader outlook, but it is something for us to keep an eye on moving forward. For now, this does reinforce our expectation for interest rates to stay higher for longer. I'm not expecting the Federal Reserve to raise rates. I also don't think they'll have much room to begin cutting rates anytime soon. Inflation is, I'd say it's evolving rather than disappearing or moving lower. Even if gasoline prices fall, persistent inflation in technology, services, and other sectors could keep overall inflation above the Fed's comfort zone, which is 2%. This week, economic calendars should give us a little more insight into how policymakers are thinking about that challenge. On Wednesday, we'll get the minutes from the Federal Reserve's June FOMC meeting. We'll be looking for any clues about how concerned the committee members were about inflation and what they need to see before becoming comfortable with rate cuts. We know that Kevin Warsh is not big on communication, so the minutes may not reveal too much, but we'll see. We'll also receive the New York Fed's monthly survey of one-year consumer inflation expectations. It's an important report because inflation expectations, they can be self-fulfilling. If consumers expect prices to rise, it can influence wage negotiations, spending decisions, and ultimately move inflation higher. So while headlines may focus on lower oil prices, we'll be paying close attention to whether inflation pressures are quietly building beneath the surface in other areas. So I'm going to leave it there for this week. Thank you all for joining me. Have a great week ahead. I'll look forward to seeing you next week.